Welcome back to the Midlife Maverick podcast. I'm Stretch Trainer, your host, and today I'm stepping into a world I honestly didn't know much about, Stoicism. Now, I admit, my old belief was that Stoic meant tight-lipped, tough, bury your emotions, get on with it, and don't feel anything. That classic image of the guy who just carries the load. But then I sat down with today's guest, William Spears, a nuclear submarine officer who leads high-performance teams in some of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. And what he taught me flipped everything I thought I knew about Stoicism on its head. This conversation goes deep into emotions, purpose, fear, fatherhood, integrity, the warrior archetype, and how men in midlife can use Stoic principles to become wiser, calmer, more grounded versions of ourselves. If you want practical wisdom for becoming the man you're meant to be, you're in the right place. Before we dive in, can I ask a quick favor? If you find value in this episode, please like it, share it with a mate, and subscribe to the podcast. It generally helps the message reach more men who need to hear it. My promise to you is to keep improving this show, bringing great conversations, stories, struggles, achievements, and life lessons that help all of us live with more vitality, strength, clarity, and purpose. And if you want to be part of a brotherhood of men doing this work together, join the Midlife Mavericks community. The link is in the show notes. Let's get into this episode with William Spears.
Stretch, glad to be here, man.
I'm looking forward to this conversation because you've got a pretty extraordinary background from nuclear submarines to philosophy. So it's going to be an interesting chat. Before we dive in, a couple of questions I always like to ask my guests at the start of the podcast. Number one is, if you and I were to be boarding a flight, where would that flight be going? Do you have a favorite holiday destination, or is there a bucket list item that you'd love to tick off?
Yeah, I would love, I did some backpacking around Europe when I was in college, and I would love to do that again, bring my family there. I really enjoyed Scotland, Glasgow and Edinburgh. Scotland was really interesting, and I'm really anxious to get back there. I really enjoyed France. Paris was a remarkable place to be as a young guy with a backpack, and I would love to go back as an adult who can actually afford a hotel and all those things. Hey, Stretch, before we get going, I've got a disclaimer I have to say before I forget to. So, because I am
Yeah.
actively serving in the military in the U.S., it is important that I'm clear that I am just here speaking on my own behalf. This is just William Spears talking. I'm not speaking on behalf of the U.S. Navy or the U.S. government in any capacity. And if I endorse some product or, link to something or anything, that's just my own opinion. It has nothing to do with the government. That's one of those things I have to say, because if I screw it up, I'll say some dumb thing and someone will attribute it to the Navy or something like that. So no, it's just me. I'm just William Spears.
No
Anyway.
worries, William. Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks for putting that in there, mate, and making that clear. And I'm glad that we've got William here with us today and not the US government. So it's a good thing.
Yeah.
William, if we were on this plane and we're off to Europe to, Scotland and France and all these places, and you and I were to spark up a conversation and we were talking about, your mission and passion in life right now, what would you say that would be?
I want more people to realize the power of understanding their own morality and their own kind of ability to develop as a human being, and how many functions in life are improved by that. I want more people to be better. I specifically, my target audience is primarily people in the military, just because that's the experience that I have and that I understand. And that's the angle I come at. But I think that these ideas are universal, and they have been universal for thousands of years. And that's kind of a big point that resonates importantly in my writing and kind of my worldview. And I think that it's a powerful idea, is how many different important ideas come together, and the test of philosophical coherence is kind of how those things manifest in real life. And so basically, I think that we are improved by our contact with good ideas. And so the more that good ideas can spread around, I think that's how we do good in this world.
Okay, mate. I like that. And it's awesome to hear that, you're trying to improve, other people's lives and to connect people with these philosophical ideas that you talk about. I'm curious, like for you, where did this start? Like obviously you've been heavily involved with the military for a long time. When did you start to think about this line of thinking?
So I write specifically about Stoicism.
Mm.
I've always been, what I would consider a deep thinker. I've always thought about what is right and wrong, and why do we think that those things are right and wrong, and kind of been critical of what I think are a lot of assumptions in that regard. Growing up, I was, as a young guy, as a teenager, I was very frustrated with what I saw as hypocrisy around me, and a lot of people who I think are, not going through life thinking through the things that they purport to believe, or the things that they purport to, the reasons for which they say that they do things. And I think, now I know that that's a very common view. A lot of people see that and are around them and get frustrated in the same way. I didn't really discover Stoicism specifically until I was partway through my journey in the military, and I discovered it in the military. Uh, so Stoicism has kind of exploded onto the popular scene on the internet in the last decade or so. It really kind of blew up in 2010s. But before that, it was has there's always been an undercurrent of it in the military services, and that, there's very good reasons for that that we can get into. And I discovered it, there's always been kind of an undercurrent of Stoicism at the United States Naval Academy. And after being enlisted in the service for a few years, I through some miracle wound up at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. And it was my first year there studying kind of the heroic figures there that I came across the philosophy of Stoicism. And I was like, oh, this is how I think about a lot of things already, and discovering that there, led to me to really dig into the philosophy and make sure I understand it more. And, eventually I started writing on it.
Okay, awesome. You mentioned there that like Stoicism is a part of the US military, like the way they sort of, I suppose, their structure or the way they are. Can you give us a little bit more of an insight in what you mean about that?
Well, it's not in any official capacity that it is.
Mm.
And I think it's important. I think it works better as a kind of underground and cultural thing. But what the philosophy of Stoicism is largely about controlling yourself, obeying yourself, being self-disciplined, and disciplining your emotional responses to the environment around you, because it's the right thing to do, and in a way that facilitates doing the right thing. Those things feed in on each other. And that is a very military way of thinking. And so it's a way of thinking that's constructive in all capacities of life, but is particularly constructive in the military whenever you're, facing things that can be very frightening or very arduous, very difficult to endure, and where your ability to handle these things emotionally can make the difference between life and death for yourself and everyone that you know. So, it's absolutely appropriate to the military, and that's why I argue it is a warrior philosophy, and that's what I mean by that. But the so there was a particular hero of mine when I was at the Naval Academy who was very into the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, and explained how it informed his ability to survive and endure with honor in kind of this prisoner of war scenario, in this torture camp scenario where he was the commander of the prisoners of war there. And it was by through his writings that I came across this philosophy, and kind of and informed a lot of things in my thinking as I continued to mature.
Yeah, beautiful. You mentioned there like the warrior philosopher. Can you give us a little bit more of an insight into that? Because as part of what I'm doing with Men in Midlife, we're talking about the warrior to king transformation. And we're using the idea of the warrior as a masculine archetype. He's always striving, he's always pushing, he's always trying to get more. And we see how that archetype serves men in their sort of 20s to 30s when they're, getting their job, climbing the corporate ladder, looking for status, maybe money, maybe trying to find a partner. But then as they get to midlife, there's this transition that we take them through in terms of king. But I'm curious to hear more about the warrior philosopher that you mentioned there.
Sure. So it is important to distinguish, the archetype, the way that you use the warrior archetype as a distinguished from the king archetype, and as kind of a transition point. I'm using the word warrior differently from that, although there's a lot of parallel. In the way that I use the warrior, I'm specifically speaking to the profession of arms, people in the military. I clarify that kind of out in the assumptions. And, I'm basically arguing that, what a warrior philosopher is in my mind is a philosophical warrior, someone who is a member of the profession of arms who thinks deeply about their philosophical, and their moral makeup and their reasons for doing the things that they do. In your archetype, where that plays out, that would be kind of a transition to a king archetype. I think that a philosopher, as I am using the term there, is the way that you would describe a king. Somebody who has transitioned or is in the process of transitioning, recognizes their limitations and seeks to overcome them and transcend them and basically fulfill their rational nature as a human being to become what they are supposed to be, which in the ancient philosophical construct, that is to become a fully moral person and to be a ultimately a good person. Is the old argument is that it is in human nature to become wise as you mature, and wisdom is synonymous with virtue. And any lack of virtue or any vice is an absence of wisdom. So that's how we get the old Socratic idea that if somebody is vicious or evil or something like that, that is a manifestation of ignorance. If someone is doing something wrong, it is because they necessarily don't know better. They don't know that that is the wrong thing to do, that they're actually harming themselves. And if they were wise, if they knew better, they would not behave viciously.
Okay. Yeah. Well said. I get a much better understanding of what you're doing there. I'm curious then. So, if the warrior philosopher is this wiser military asset or person, is there a journey they have to go on to be able to get to that position? And if so, what are they before they transition to this? Have you got a term for that, or how does this go? How do you go into place with this?
Well, so this is whenever we get into the way the Stoics looked at things. And basically, it's a paradox of Stoicism that has been misunderstood or has been puzzling, has been paradoxical since, in 2000 years ago, whenever the philosophers were walking around in Athens talking about this stuff. The Stoics believed that one is either virtuous or not, and that all who are not virtuous are equally non-virtuous or equally vicious. And so that a lot of people perceive that as an unattainable ideal, that the virtuous person is something that, well, no one can be perfect. And the answer to that is, well, it's just a matter of how we define our terms. Really, what they're doing is defining virtue as moral perfection. And they're saying you are either perfect or not. And until you are perfect, you've got a lot of work to do. And so there's, the term within Stoic philosophy for a perfect individual is what they would call a sage. And so people see that and they think, well, why would I want to do this whenever I could never become a sage realistically? So why would I pursue this philosophy? The answer to that is that the goal of the philosophy, the purpose is not unmet if you do not achieve being a sage, like being a black belt or being a PhD or some certification that you can get. That's not how it works. The point is that you realize your limitations as a human and you realize that you got a job to do to strive to fix them and strive endlessly. And that's how you actually get better. And you see that, and that effect is true in any organization or any kind of human effort, whether it's fitness, whether it's study, whether it's a team sport or something. Like how many coaches or how many drill sergeants in the military or whatever collective endeavor that you're trying to get a group of people to do or an individual to do have said, if we're not getting better, we're getting worse. And that same thing works on a moral level. If we're not getting better as human beings, then we're necessarily getting worse. And recognizing that is a massive achievement in your development as a human being. And that's part of the ideal of why we say everyone who is not a sage is what the Stoics would call a progressor, someone who is making progress. And we are all, practically speaking, progressors from the moment that we recognize that we need to get our act together, and we've got this constant burden. So an ancient critic of the Stoics, a guy named Plutarch, criticized them and said that, well, these clowns over here, they're basically saying that the purpose of their philosophy is like an archer aiming, basically trying as hard not to hit the target with his arrow, but trying as hard, aiming as well as he can for the purpose of aiming as well as he can. And I argue that his criticism would land, his criticism would be valid if doing all that effort to aim as well as you can did not yield any benefit to the individual or all who know him. But in fact, you know, aiming as well as you can makes you better. It clears up untruths. It makes you more wise. It makes you more honorable. It makes you more courageous and just and self controlled. And that benefits not just the individual, but everyone who knows them. And so there is absolutely a point to it, even if you will never be perfect.
Well said. Well said. I like that. With our men, we're often trying to get them to redefine what success looks like for them. And like they're striving for, let's call it the sage, as you put it, but they're striving to be that version of themselves by understanding that success, the way they define success is going to be different in this stage of their life. And the way they look at success is potentially going to be different to my success or your success or someone else's success. But they're always striving to make changes, to be wiser and to move towards the king or towards the sage and be the better version of themselves. You mentioned like Stoic principles can help us, I suppose, navigate different aspects of our life. How do you feel this would show up, whether it's in war, business, or in family life? How can Stoicism help us navigate maybe chaos?
Well, we're always going to encounter situations that are going to uh, demand some kind of emotional response from us. And the natural impulse is going to be to respond in some way that is probably not constructive. Whether that is in a corporate boardroom or if I am, 500 feet underwater in a submarine and the water starts pouring in and I have this impulse to clam up or this impulse to become frightened or frustrated or whatever, instead of cold and calculating and doing the right thing. So the stoic view of any kind of situation that is beyond my control is that thing is an indifferent. That thing doesn't reflect on my moral makeup, and so it doesn't not merit my emotional response. The keystone concept of stoicism is that virtue is what is good. Virtue is the soul good, and that is specifically moral virtue that we're talking about, my moral makeup. And so what you will hear a lot in the kind of popular takes on stoicism is that it is about separating what is in my control and what is not, or what they call the dichotomy of control and kind of the blogosphere. Now, that dichotomy is not the point, is kind of what I argue, is that's an important side effect. But what that dichotomy does is separating the things that I can control from the things that I can't control. What that does for you is that is a philosophical test of those things that are moral factors and those things that are not. And if it is not a moral factor, then it doesn't merit my emotional investment. It doesn't deserve anything more than me to acknowledge it and say, okay, there's going to be some set of appropriate actions that are going to follow from this situation, this development. Whether that is that, someone said something insulting to me in a meeting, or someone cut me off in traffic, or there's water pouring into my submarine. Whatever is the situation, there's some appropriate response, and it's probably not to get emotional about it. I think how that can manifest. But it's not just about being, self-controlled in a way just to make myself tough and successful. It's about doing what's right and doing those things because those are the right things to do. And that's what an ideal human would do. And that's how an ideal human would respond in those situations. And so that has a lot of bearing on justice. Justice has a lot of bearing on how we develop as human beings. If I'm not behaving in a just way, I'm probably misunderstanding my priorities somehow, and that's probably going to bite me at some point later. I'm going to regret that at some point in my life.
Interesting. You talk about emotional control there, and I'm curious, like, do you see emotional control as a strength or as a danger if it goes too far?
So I think that it is a common misunderstanding that Stoicism is about suppressing your emotions. And there's two sides of this. One is the people who, the kind of Stoic apologists out there will be like, oh, well, it's not about suppressing your emotions. We would never want to suppress our emotions. We want to understand them. We want to be in touch with them. And I'm kind of like, all right, let's table that. you know. So first of all, let's talk about what it actually is. It's not about saying, "Oh, I'm not angry, I'm not sad, I'm not whatever." It is about saying, "Why am I angry? Why am okay, I recognize the emotion that I'm experiencing in this instant and saying, "Okay, why am I feeling that? What is the underlying belief that is leading me to be angry, afraid, sad, worried, whatever the thing is? What is the belief?" And saying, "Well, okay, is that actually true?" And more likely than not, it's not true. And then more likely than not, it speaks to some misplaced priority, misplaced judgment, and correcting that judgment is the philosophical approach, and that has a lot of ties into psychotherapy that I'd like to get to because it is important. But that is what you're doing with your emotions is identifying them, understanding them, and hopefully setting yourself up to respond to them in a constructive way. Okay. Now let's get to the question of suppressing emotions. I think that we have largely gone too far in our effort to get in touch with our emotions and for men to understand why they think the things they think and do the things they do to say like, well, we don't ever want to, suppress emotions. What does that mean? Does that mean that, someone yells at me in a meeting or says something insulting that I should yell at them back? And, or, you know, if I am if I'm giving rudder orders, I'm standing there in the control room of my submarine and something frustrates me or frightens me, should I start crying? If I feel compelled, is that the right thing? Is that what we want that officer to do in that moment? Obviously, it's not. And so if I say, well, even though you want to cry, you shouldn't cry, is that not suppressing your emotions? It is not. As long as you understand, you recognize, I am sad, I am frustrated, and now I'm going to make some wise decision about this thing. Refusing to indulge those emotions and refusing to give in to your childish impulses, your impulsive responses is not suppression. That's just rational judgment. That is what is expected of a rational human being. That's not suppression. So I think it's important to clarify that difference. I hope that answers the question.
No, it does, definitely. I'm curious to follow up with that, though, because I think, with masculinity these days, and I feel for a lot of men, we're sort of told to suppress our emotions. There's pressure on us through society to say, don't cry, to be tough, to be stoic, to be strong. We hear these different things. And I'm sure there's pressure in the military to show up a certain way too. And I think a lot of men find it hard to connect with those emotions or even name those emotions, like how they're feeling and understanding those emotions so that maybe they can control them and make wiser decisions. What do you think about that in your experience? And obviously, the military is mainly a male dominated sort of environment. What do you see with the men around you?
Yeah, I mean, it's all about the right time and place to respond a certain way. A good example, especially from, the masculine, and I I love when people want to say like men are, women are super emotional and men are not. And it's like, okay, how about anger? Let's talk anger. And one of the things I'll get is isn't it sometimes anger going to be helpful? Like if you're in a fight situation, or are you going to do battle better if you're angry, or is anger going to motivate you to correct some wrong or to work a little bit harder at something that now you perceive some injustice, so you're going to work harder to fix it? Well, it turns out the that 2000 years ago this was argued about at length, and the conclusion that the old philosophers came to is no, it would be better to do all those appropriate things without the complication of this extra emotion that's going to spin me off and potentially make me act rashly in some spin me off in some inappropriate direction. A good example is think about a prize fighter. So if you're going up in an MMA or boxing match or something like that, would you rather be the guy that gets pissed off at the other guy, or would you rather be the guy that remains cold and calculating while the other guy gets pissed off? Which one do you want to be in that fight? and it's you want to be the one who's calculating. And so if I'm in a in a torpedo engagement, I've got to go develop a fire control solution on some ship. I want to be as absolutely precise and calculating as I can. I do not want an emotion anywhere near that tactical problem. So no, I want to be calculating. I want to identify the emotion that is at play and treat it appropriately and act on it as appropriate when the right time and place demands.
Interesting. Was the younger version of William this calm and calculated? Or has this been something that you've obviously learned over time to master?
Let me be perfectly clear. I am not a perfectly calm and calculating guy. I never have been and I never will be. The point is what are the qualities that I admire and what I strive to be. I think that younger William recognized that being calculating and self-controlled was good. I don't think that younger William understood why quite as well. So this is a point that I try to make, especially when I'm dealing with really young men of any type. But the audiences that I tend to come into contact with are typically warriors. And I mean warriors in the professional sense, war fighters.
Yeah.
Maybe for the purpose of this podcast, when we're dealing with archetypes, that's the term I should use whenever I mean this. If I go to a room full of young warfighters and I say, all right, guys, I'm here to talk to you about morality, about doing right and wrong, they're all going to roll their eyes in the back and they're just going to say, what is this
Yeah.
church? Like I got all this when I was a kid. I don't need to hear about morality because you hear morality, you think helping little old ladies across the street, or staying away from booze, or staying away from women until it's your wife or something like all this stuff that doesn't sound that tough. But instead, if I go to a bunch of young warfighters and I say, I'm here to talk to you about self control, I'm here to talk to you about conquering fear, conquering distraction. I'm here to talk to you about wisdom. I'm here to talk to you about being perfectly productive with your time, using your time appropriately, justly, and being perfectly self obedient. If I say those things, I will have everyone's attention. But the fact is, all those qualities I just described are the qualities of an ideal human being, and they have been for thousands of years. All those qualities are morality. That is what morality is. The perfect human being, as defined 2,000 years ago, is one who is wise, courageous, self controlled, and just. Those are the four qualities of an ideal human that ancient philosophers figured out. And any kind of world religion or worldview is going to have some variant of that because whether they arrived at it, whether they were influenced by the ancient Greeks or they arrived at it independently, it's going to be something like that. Those are called the cardinal virtues, and they work like the primary colors of red, yellow, and blue, where they don't reduce any further. And any kind of other ideal quality of a human being is going to be some kind of mixture or derivative of those, but you can't reduce them any further. Wisdom, courage, self-control, or justice are the four qualities of a human being. And so that is morality. That's what we want to be. And so when I talk to a bunch of young, tough guys and they want to be brave, they want to be self-controlled, but they're not really thinking about why. Why is that they want to be those things? And it's because they've got it in their head at some point in their development that that's what they're supposed to be. That's what's expected of them. And it's because it is. It's because it's true. It's what an ideal human being is. And so understanding morality and understanding that those things are what you want to be for the very good reason that they're right, that the right way to think about things. And this has been figured out for thousands of years, I think is a very powerful idea. And so that I would say is the difference between what Warrior William as the archetype that you use and King William, or
Yeah.
aspiring King William, to adopt your archetype. That's the difference in the way I think about those things, is aspiring to become what I am supposed to be because
Awesome.
I'm supposed to be it.
I love that analogy that you talked about there of the colors and how we're blending the colors to figure out, different aspects of our life and where we're heading with that. I'm curious now because you've talked about stepping into teaching these young men, these principles. And I feel that there's probably a strong connection there between men who are striving in their careers, in their job, status, power, success, whatever they define that as, and then stepping into midlife and feeling that maybe there's something missing and they need to transition into more of the king role, but unsure how to do that. So I'm curious to learn a little bit more about how you help these young men realize maybe Stoicism and how it can serve them.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is Stoicism isn't necessarily for everyone. You know,
Yeah.
I think it would be wrong to approach it like a religion or something like that. There are people who do, and you can. I don't think that that is the most constructive way to approach any way of thinking. I'm what's called a philosophical eclectic. If I see an idea and the question I ask is, well, is it true? You know, and if I don't think it's true, then it's wrong and I shouldn't really spend any time on it. But if I do think it's true, or I think that there is an underlying philosophical truth to it, then maybe I'll spend some time on that. So I think recognizing that is an important piece of it. I personally, I don't call myself a Stoic because it's much simpler for me to say a necessary condition of what constitutes a Stoic is that you lived 2,000 years ago whenever there was a actual Hellenistic school called the Stoics. And that way I don't have to quibble with anyone over what are the necessary and sufficient conditions of a modern Stoic or whatever. I just don't care. That's for other people to quibble about. I'm about, okay, what ideas did they have? What did the ancient Stoics say? And then we can figure out. It's up to us. We're gonna have to figure out for ourselves if we think they were right about stuff or not. And the fact is that, I mean, this stuff comes from 2,000 years ago. I mean, it was before electricity. They're going to be wrong about some things, but they were right about a lot more stuff than they were wrong about. And the reason we still talk about ancient ideas today is because what has come to us from thousands of years ago is the best of it. It's the same reason that whenever we listen to music today, we say, that, "Oh, the classics are the best," and all the music today sucks. But the classic era that I listen to, for a lot of people, it's classic rock or something like that. That's when songs were good. Well, the reality is a lot of music back then sucked too. We just don't listen to those songs anymore. you know, and it's the same reason that we still study Shakespeare in school is because these old, classics get at things that are, cut to the core of what it means to be a human being on earth that is true in past, present, and future. It was true 2,000 years ago, and it's going to be true 2,000 years from now. That's the stuff I like to talk about is the stuff, the core truths that are just always going to be relevant. They're classic. That's why they're classic. So that is kind of the point. That's how I think to approach it. So for someone who is making that transition in life and aspiring to become a king, I would say seek the classics, whether that is Stoicism or something else. It might not resonate with everybody. Marcus Aurelius in particular is not where I would start. you know, he's the one. He's the popular one. Everyone knows his name because he's got a beautiful name, and he was in Gladiator. What else could you possibly want? But really, Epictetus is the man when it comes to the Roman Stoics, and really guys like Cicero and Seneca are the ones to recommend. That they're the kind of entry point as far as I'm concerned. But whether it's those guys or it's some other philosophy, some other ancient moral writer, seek the classics, because the reason that we still study them is because they get to core truths of what it means to be a human. So I think that there's a lot of value derived in there, and recognizing that there's really not a lot new under the sun. I don't want to say there's nothing new, but there's a lot, whenever people start studying ancient philosophy, and they study the really good stuff, the stuff that is highly recommended, that a lot of people, and to know if something's highly recommended, are they teaching it in schools? And if they're teaching it in schools, there's probably a reason. That also means that you probably don't need to pay for it. It's probably available for free, and you can just go dig online or find it at your library and find, okay, why did people say Plato's Republic is so good? I'm reading this and it reads like crap. Why is this interesting? Well, you read this analysis over here that is maybe appropriate for high schoolers, and you say, this is an allegory for, the ideal society, but the ideal society is being used as an allegory for the moral development of man. Wow, that's really deep. What else is under the hood there, and digging into that. I think that is how you make that transition. And that forces you to recognize that these ideas are not new. People have been thinking about this for a long time. These people a long time ago struggled with the same things that I do. I think that there is a lot of power in that experience.
Yeah, wonderful. I like that you said the classics, and they've really stood the test of time, haven't they? And it sounds like, with a lot of this philosophy that we're digging into, and what it is to be human, it's what stood the test of time, and what we can take forward now that applied back then and is still current in this day and age. I love your curiosity. I love the energy that you've got when you talk about, the old philosophy and the way you dive into it, and the research that you've obviously done to get a good understanding of that now.
I think that we're really in danger of, if you get especially get caught up in all the stuff that is made to that you're just coming across social media feed and all the stuff that's made to get you anxious and made to bother you, made to get you angry. You can spend a lot of time spinning your wheels in mud, fretting about things that are not gonna matter next week, much less next year. You should be thinking about stuff that's gonna matter thousands of years from now. you know, things that are going to be true thousands of years in what some politicians said or some commentator said, "Oh, I'm so angry about I can't believe that person said this terrible thing." Like, who cares? No one's going to care about this person in a few weeks, much less a few years. And so that's I think I derive a lot of equanimity from that recognition, recognizing the signal from the noise, recognizing
Mm.
what is noise and how much is just short-term nonsense that's just not going to matter later, and we're not going to be talking about this or that scandal or this or that news item. Who cares? I mean, sure, it's very important right now. Is it going to be very important next year? Is it going to be very important a decade from now? Unlikely.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of it comes back to really being in alignment and understanding what's important to us, I suppose, but also aligning ourselves with what matters most. And we can easily get distracted by all the noise that's happening, especially with social media these days, because there's an argument to and fro all the time that we want to step up to. And maybe it's that emotional control that you spoke about before. We can easily get angry and we want to fight our case. But I think having alignment and knowing, who the man we want to become is and what's important and what matters allows us to say yes or no, or to ignore the stuff that's really not affecting us in the way that's going to be proactive or helpful as we move forward. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a very helpful technique to help keep those things in perspective is recognizing our own mortality. Not just our
Yeah.
morality, but our mortality. Recognizing that I'm gonna die, and this thing that I'm worried about, that I'm concerned about, this promotion or this what guy in my unit, in my military unit, this other guy over here gets the award and gets the recognition, and he doesn't deserve it. I really deserve it. I'm going to be worm food soon. I'm going to die. Like, does that matter? I should be thinking about the time I'm spending with my kids, instead of who's getting some trivial award, some piece of cloth and paper and recognition that's going to last all of 30 seconds. I should be worried about what I'm teaching my kids right now. That's what matters. That's what's going to be left of me, whenever, I'm dust. And I will be dust before long in the grand scheme of things. It won't be long. And so I think recognizing our own short period of time on Earth is very helpful in keeping things in perspective and helping us to focus on doing the right thing. And that is a very ancient mental technique as well.
You mentioned legacy there. I hear you talking about, the impression that you leave on your kids, and you're thinking about, when you are dust, when you are worm food. How do you feel that Stoicism shapes you as a parent?
Well, it's funny you should ask that. That's one I don't get asked a lot. It definitely helps with the emotional piece, and kind of the parts that we've already talked about is maintaining the appropriate emotions and not overreacting to things in an inappropriate way or unconstructive way. It is important to point out, one of the questions that is natural whenever you talk about controlling your emotions is like, well, is that going to make me cold and unconnecting to my family? And the answer is no, absolutely not. Because there is an emotional component to appropriately filling my role as a father and as a husband, and appropriately doing that job. And philosophy is nothing if not, ultimately impelling me to do my job, whatever that is. And as a father, that involves, deeply connecting with my kids and my wife, and being able to connect with them at an emotional level. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to get carried away. I'm not going to become so emotional that I can't leave them to go to work or to go to sea to go deploy, or to become so preoccupied with surviving and coming home and being a father that now I'm a coward and I won't do the dangerous thing that is my responsibility to do. No, I need my kids to see me being courageous and being, appropriate and doing my job for my country, even whenever that's dangerous. My kids need to see that so they know what an appropriate man does. And that's how all those things play together. But it doesn't mean being cold and unconnecting. Now, one of the fun things is, do I teach my kids Stoicism? And I would say I don't teach them about, like, they don't know the word Stoicism. They don't know the names of these philosophers. I do ask them, hey, what are the qualities of a good human? What are the cardinal virtues of a good human being? And they can name them. And we talk about them, and we talk about what they look like, what self-control looks like in real life, what courage looks like in real life, and what wisdom is. The other thing that we talk about is being responsible for what I can control and what I can't, and recognizing that nobody can compel me to do anything. Any action that I do is a response of some choice, even if it's the choice to live when there's a gun to my head. That is still my action. That is still my choice, and it's still my responsibility. Ultimately, my responsibility might be informed by my circumstances, such as a gun pointed to my head, but ultimately, I have to take responsibility for that choice. So whenever, my two little boys are arguing, and one of them says, hey, Jake made me, hit him, and the other one says, no one can make you do anything. I'm just like, yes, yes, perfect, and so that's kind of how I would say it informs my parenting.
Yeah, awesome, mate. I like that. And that was a prime example that you used there with the little ones, I'm sure. And it's awesome that you talk about it too in terms of other aspects of your life. Like, it's showing up for your kids, it's showing up for your partner. It's obviously showing up for work and for the role that you've got with your life. Are there any negatives that you feel that come from Stoicism? Is there stuff that you would prefer not to be attached to it, or stuff that you feel isn't current for the life you live right now?
I think that the idea that virtue is the sole good and that I should react with equanimity and, in fact, embrace, because it's not just react indifferently, it ultimately is that I should be glad for whatever happens to me. That becomes particularly harder and harder to accept or to really make any use of. Even if I can say that's what a perfect person, a perfect stoic sage, how that person would react to that thing, it's useful to say that's what right would look like, but it becomes harder and harder to find any useful thing to do with it whenever it involves things like bad things happening to my loved ones or something like that. So a perfect stoic sage would say, if my kid, came down with a terrible disease or something like that, would say, well, that's neither good nor bad. That's indifferent, and I should react indifferently to that thing. I think that I'm going to view that as a bad thing. And if I just say, well, that's just a very dispreferred indifferent, it's very, very dispreferred. I'm just screwing around with language to try to say what I really mean, which is that that's really bad. And I would really much prefer that my kid not have, this disease or have this terrible thing happen to them. I don't think it loses all value there, because you can still say that, okay, well, I'm not going to wail about it. I'm not going to become crippled by grief in this situation. No matter how bad the situation is, no matter how bad the event that might occur is, or how dispreferred that event might be, there is a right and a wrong way to react to it. And I think recognizing what a perfect stoic sage would do in this situation is helpful still in reacting. It makes me more likely to react in a constructive way, no matter how bad the tragedy that befalls me. But it becomes less and less believable that that is actually true, that's actually not a bad thing, that my kid was harmed in some way. Like, of course, that's bad, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
So I hope that that kind of answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. I think, bad things can happen in life and they can be out of our control, but there are still choices after these bad things happen. So we have a choice of how we react to that. And we can obviously spiral down into that negative place, or we can try to make the best of that scenario. So I think those principles that you talk about and the choices that we have are still very relevant, even in the worst circumstances. So I feel that makes good sense. For someone who hasn't really got, let's say for the listeners, for men listening now and tuning in and hearing more about Stoicism, and they're curious to learn more, where would you point them? Where's a good place to start if they really have no understanding about Stoicism at all?
So there are infinite resources online right now, and that's almost the problem because it's like every other dude right now discovers it and they're like, this is really cool. And then like week two, they start a blog, you know. There are lots of popular books. I would recommend a guy named Donald Robertson. His book, How to Think Like a Stoic Emperor, is it basically puts everything in the context of Marcus Aurelius, which is kind of the most popular Stoic. But if you just go and read Marcus Aurelius's stuff, it might resonate with you. You might be like, this is crap. Why would I read this? But Donald Robertson's book, How to Think Like a Stoic Emperor, really puts it in context. My book I don't recommend as a starting point. It's basically how I would explain stoicism to an admiral, in the military. It's basically, it takes it through it, and the way I approach it is like, let's dig to this thing as far down as it goes and explain it in as much meticulous detail as I can without getting into the point of being a college textbook. And so some people might, if you're not introduced to the philosophy already, then that might be a little bit too much of a leap. There's another guy named Ryan Holiday who puts out like another Stoic book like every few months. He's a very prolific and very popular writer. So a lot of people find his books very accessible. I like Donald Robertson's stuff because I think it gets a little bit deeper into it without becoming inaccessible and without becoming too academic. So that's kind of where I would start. You can Google this stuff for easily, and all of the original sources are all available for free. You don't need to buy anything. That's where I would start.
Beautiful, great references. That brings me to the question is, what made you write your book?
Well, the and the question of like, who is this book for is
Yeah.
is a uh, is a good one. It's for philosophical young men who particularly of the warrior archetype as I describe it, which is, in the profession of arms. The I basically, I discovered stoicism when I was at the Naval Academy in my early 20s. And then it was kind of like in my mid to late 20s, whenever I had done my first little experience at sea. I'd done my first tour on a submarine as a what we call a division officer. And I came back from that and I was kind of decompressing and started engaging with pop culture again, because you don't really engage with any of that while you're on a submarine. But I discovered that stoicism had exploded on the popular, in the popular sphere. And I'm just like, what the hell is this? Like, suddenly everyone's a stoic and everyone's interested in this thing that I've been interested in forever. And that's a thing. At first it's kind of like annoying. You're like, no, that was my thing. You can't have it. That was my secret. Admiral Stockdale and I, we were, that's our thing. And how are you guys all into that? But I quickly realized that that's a bad attitude to have. That's the wrong attitude to have. And anyone who ever says to you, well, I was into stoicism before it was cool, you're like, okay, are you a vampire? It's 2000 years old, man. Basically discovering that it had become popular, I immediately recognized there's all these different arguments out there and a lot of different people trying to appropriate and steer it in their own direction and say like, well, if you really read the Stoics, you would know that they think that the military is evil. And, that's clearly not accurate to anything. But that's just one of many points of view that are out there. You've also got the kind of macho guys that are like, well, here's how you use stoicism to get chicks or to get rich and all that. And it's like that you clearly didn't read it either if you
Yeah.
think that any of that stuff is what they would think is important, you know? So I basically wanted to clear up what I saw as a lot of confusion for the benefit of people in the military and say like, okay, here is how it applies. And when I say it is a warrior philosophy, I mean it is the closest thing on planet Earth to kind of the Jedi religion or something that, a prepackaged set of ideas about how the world works and what is right and wrong and how I should think about things that is appropriate to the profession of arms. It is the quintessential idea of a packaged set of ideas that works like that as a coherent philosophy. And so recognizing the need for that is what inspired me to write the book. And it took a long time. People ask like, well, how do you manage a career? How did you do this whenever you're a freaking submarine officer and you're going to sea and stuff? Well, I didn't do any writing while I was at sea. At that point I was trying to manage my submarine. But when I was on shore duty, that's when I took the time to do it, and keeping to a routine and just doing it for a long time. It took me the greater part of a decade to write the damn thing. you know,
Wow.
so the key to getting something like that completed is starting a long time ago. and anyway, that's why I wrote it, and I hope that answers.
No, it's a great story, mate. Thank you for sharing that. What lessons did you take? Did you surprise yourself when you wrote it? Was there anything that you learnt in the job of writing that book that you didn't know before?
Absolutely. And this is true. Any author is gonna tell you this is that, you set out to write one thing and then your ideas evolve. And a lot of times, and this is true of being a writer, and I was a writer before I was an author, writing essays and, just journaling and things like that. And I can't recommend journaling enough to men. I think it is an extremely valuable exercise because there's so many things that you don't know. For one thing, you don't know, or that you don't really you know, but you don't really realize it about yourself until you go to write it down and you say, "Oh, this is why I think this thing, or this is how I think about this thing." It's an extremely valuable exercise to just go through that effort and just spend a little bit of time every day doing it. But so setting out to write a book, I thought I understood this philosophy, all the mechanics of it and all the ideas. And I understood about maybe 10% of it. I thought I had it. I read all the ancient Stoic texts and everything. I hadn't really read any of the analysis and any of the kind of the deeper framing and the different professors and people who study this stuff for a living and how they put them together and they compare them to each other and they draw references and cross reference to other historical events and all that stuff. So putting all that stuff together and seeing how these ideas bounce off of each other and how they interact to form a coherent philosophy is really what I think came into being and coalesced in the process of writing it. A big point is coherency. It's one thing, an idea here, you might have a belief here, an idea here, and a belief here, and a belief here. I believe this and this and this. Well, the process of thinking through philosophy is saying, okay, let me put those ideas together. Are there conflicts? And often there are. And we will often find, I believe this, but I also believe this, and there's a tension there. And if I don't ever really deal with it, it might be this uncomfortable tension. And I might be living a lie in some aspect,
Yeah.
or just deceiving myself in some way. Whereas whenever you put them together and you find the friction points, and you identify them, and maybe, okay, I thought I believed this, but maybe I really don't when I think about it longer. And finding the way to have these various beliefs and ideas that don't just they're not just compatible with each other, but they reinforce one another and they strengthen one another. That's coherency, and that is kind of the ultimate test of philosophical validity: is do these various ideas reinforce one another, and how does that manifest in a human being? Does that produce a human being that is what I want to be and what I point at and I say, that's a good human, and I would like to be like that. And I think that is kind of the writing process really helped that come into being for me.
Excellent. How did that change your day-to-day living? Was there anything that you took away that you just thought, okay, no, I'm not living in alignment. This is the big things I need to change to get myself back in alignment?
I think that it helped clarify, it helped me connect a big gap in the way I saw, sorting out my values in my 20s. I really wanted to be a wise and good person. I wanted to be a family man, and a wise and good person. All those kind of things were in one bucket, but in this other bucket, I wanted to be some kind of, badass. I wanted to be as sharp edged and as successful and as powerful and as just extreme and all the all the little meters on the baseball card of life of what a human being can be. And I kind of saw those two things as conflicting and it's like, well, I'm going to figure it out one day. And I had it in my head that, someday I'm going to not be as successful as I want to be because I'm going to need to give it all up to be a good family man or something like that, which, I haven't thankfully haven't encountered that yet. But what the concept of philosophical coherency cleared up for me is the fact that those things can work together, where basically it's the intersection of rationality and virtue. Virtue ethics is recognizing that it is virtuous to be rational. And that kind of helped put into perspective that a lot of those things that I thought were super important were just kind of stupid. Being, having this certain mark on my uniform that says that I'm of this rank or that rank, or having getting the award at in the formation, or making more money to do what with? What am I going to buy with it? Jet skis? Like what does any of this matter? you know, and, I had this vision in my 20s. I want to be super awesome badass, but recognizing, in my 30s that there's nothing more badass than seeing all these things that other people value and fret over and scramble over and they're table scraps. They're stupid. They're toys, they're trinkets. I'm indifferent to them. I don't need that stuff. You have nothing that I want, and there's just nothing more badass than that in my mind.
I love that because I feel that there's so many men burning themselves out trying to get status, the title, the job, the career, the money, the power, whatever it is, but never feeling fulfilled, never feeling happy in life, no matter how many of those goals they tick off, but they're living out of alignment. And it sounds like you've managed to wind that back in a little bit. But I'm still curious, like at some point you've had to let go of that belief. And it's nearly like letting go a little bit of the ego to be able to step into the position where you are now. Did you struggle with that, or did you find that was an easy transition once you got clear on it?
Well, again, I'm not perfect,
Mm.
and it's less that I am able to be completely indifferent to all these little ego stroke things, and more that I recognize that I should be. And that's like pointing to the sage and saying, well, how would a sage react to a promotion? Well, he wouldn't care. He wouldn't give a
Yeah.
damn. you know he's going to do his job, and what's going to come is what's going to come. And if you get promoted, and there's a certain amount of ambition that is appropriate. You don't want to be the person in your job that says like, well, I don't ever want to strive to be something better, because most like hierarchical organizations kind of expect you and kind of require you to be striving to move into leadership. And part of their efforts investing in you are with that understanding. So if the organization is expecting me to try for higher levels of supervision, higher levels of value added to the organization, and I'm just like content to sit there and be a mediocrity, then that's I'm not doing my job. I should do an appropriate level of self-investment to try to advance professionally, because that's what's expected of me and that's what's required of me from the organization. But if it doesn't work out, who cares? If it doesn't work out, what was going to come of it anyway? What actually is important is that I am manifesting as a moral individual, and all these little status signs, all these costumes, if they can be taken away from someone else, if some factor outside of my control can cause that thing to evaporate, then it was never really mine in the first place. And it doesn't reflect on me. It might say something, it might be some kind of little feather in my cap that I can say, oh, look at how hard I worked and look at what good decisions I made. And as a result, I got this promotion, or as a result, I make all this money. There, I can point to you, there are people everywhere that are working their asses off that are not getting paid that well, or did not, it didn't work out that way. Or there's 1,000 things that could have gone wrong. I could be medically disqualified from my job tomorrow. There's 1,000 things that can happen and cause all these things to evaporate. They're not really mine. They're trinkets. They're costumes. And my favorite philosopher Epictetus says that compares people who get caught up in the trappings of status with stage actors who think that their high boots and their costumes are their very selves. And that's confusion. That's a point of confusion, and you're setting yourself up for disappointment whenever someone takes your costume away. And then you say, "Oh, what am I?" Like, well, you idiot, you're whatever was under all that costume and all that garb and all that status. You're what's underneath all those things that can be controlled and controlled from external to you. You're the thing that's underneath all that.
Such a valuable message because, like you say, it can be stripped away from us at any time. We can lose our health. We could lose our job. Who is the man after that it's gone? And I think we can get to that age of retirement and we've invested so much in our careers and so much in our work. And when we retire, it's like, well, what's left? If we haven't actually built a life and hadn't aligned our life outside of that career, outside of that job, then what are we left with? And I think that's where a lot of men can feel lonely and feel like they've lost purpose or lost direction because they haven't realized just how much they've invested in that. So I think there's a lot of value in what you just said. A couple of questions I've got now is like, you've mentioned like, journaling. I'm curious, is there other practices you do that you find help the way of life that you're living?
Well, taking the time to read and study, and honestly, writing. And this is not going to be appropriate for everyone because everyone doesn't love writing in the same way that I do. But writing, saying I'm going to write an article about this thing or something like that, that forces me to engage with the material a little bit more. And so I highly recommend blogging for that reason. As much as the world does not need another philosophical blogger. It's not you don't do it for them. The world doesn't need it. It's the individual and the exercise of going through it and writing. So not necessarily just journaling, but putting out some ideas that are constructive and forcing yourself to back them up, to look up the sources and say, what have other people said about this? That's really a lot higher degree of reading. And that's why all of, university courses and everything, they make you write papers, if they still do that in a world of chat GPT, I don't know, but you know,
Different world, different world.
there's a lot of value in doing the writing. The reason they make you write is because it forces you to engage with the material. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say, physical fitness, and this is not something that the ancient philosophers did not talk a lot about. Having some kind of physical fitness routine, I think, is absolutely essential, especially today. Our world is very different. Our nutrition is very different today than it was 1,000 years ago, and it's visible in the people. It's visible in ourselves all around us that we have too much. And what we have is often poison. All the food is just full of sugar, and it's gone through this industrialized process to make it addictive, and it reflects on us and has all these kind of terrible impacts on our bodies. I think a physical fitness routine of some sort is a moral imperative. It's not just a thing for fitness people to do. It's a matter of hygiene that you just have to do as a mature adult in today's world. You have to take care of yourself. And then a third piece is sleep. I think that a good and disciplined sleep routine is absolutely essential to mental health, and probably something that should be tackled before a lot of other things. I think that, like, if we're not sleeping well and we're not working out, fix the sleep first, because that's the that's the easiest one to get to, and getting on a steady routine there buys a lot of time back. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, definitely. It's the lifestyle practices around that. And it's thinking about all those practices and how they add up. And it comes back to, that being that best version, that best human, showing up in the best way. And if you're not taking care of yourself, then it's like the mask falling from the airplane, and put it on yourself first before you put it on the people that you love and you care about. So I think it's very valid there. I want to circle back just quickly about the success and in terms of your definition of success. Like where is William heading now? What's the future for you? What goals are you chasing? If you've got goals that you're chasing, how is that set up? What are you working towards?
Yeah. Well, for a while there, getting a book published was a big one.
Mm, yeah.
But, longer term than that, from a professional standpoint, I would really like to be a captain of a submarine. Right now, there's a million things that can happen in between now and the future to make that not happen. And if so, okay, fine, But right now, that's kind of the track and that's the goal. And in a couple of years, hopefully, I'll be in command of something. We'll see. And that's been a long time going. I've been, working in the Navy submarine, pipeline, working up to that for a very long time. My previous sea job was as the second in command of a ballistic missile submarine, and so maybe I'll go back to that. But the Navy will figure that out. They'll figure out what they want to do with me. And in the meantime, I'm doing other stuff. At the end of the day, I want to have a happy and healthy family, and I have 3 boys, and I want them to grow up to be good, just, wise, self-controlled, and courageous men. And that's ultimately success for me, is if I can influence that, and if I can do everything I can to influence that. And ultimately, I might not succeed. Who knows? Like, one thing that having more than one kid will teach you is that they're little balls of chaos. There's very little, they're going to take cues from me, but they're going to be who they're going to be. And that's something that, if you only have one kid, you think like, well, why is this kid acting this way? What if I did something different? If I turned this knob or this meter in this certain way, then the kid would behave differently. This is all my fault that the kid is not acting the way that I think they should. But if you have two or more, you realize like, oh, you were completely different, even though you're raised the same. You guys are just your own actually individual moral agents, and you know you might you might copy some of the things that I say, but you're going to be your own people. But ultimately, that's success for me, is if I can get to the end of my life and have 3 adult men who are valuable, just contributors to society. That's what I want.
I can see the king energy inside of you, mate. I can see the purpose, the legacy, the caring for others. What can I give? Not about always what I can get, but you're very present with that. I also see an awesome curiosity, a great level of kindness. And obviously, you value growth because you're always challenging yourself to continue to keep growing, which is a testament to probably the work you've done there, mate. So, congratulations on that,
I
William.
appreciate that.
Is there anything that you think we haven't covered that I should have asked you about in this podcast?
Here's something that I will leave your audience with, that whenever I sign a book or whatever, I sign it, quicquid honest id utile, which is Latin for that which is honorable is useful. Okay. So what is the background on that? Those are actually the words of Cicero, who is one of my favorite philosophers, but he's a Roman statesman who's kind of most often today cited as a political philosopher. He's one of the very important progenitors to kind of legal philosophy and democracy and the way we think about government today. But he was also a commentator on the Stoics. He was not a Stoic himself, but he was very Stoic influenced, and we get a lot of our ideas from him. He built on the philosopher Socrates, hundreds of years before him, said that for something to be good, okay, what is good? What is, it was getting at the question of what is good. And he said, if an act is good, it must be both honorable and useful. And Cicero kind of took that idea and said, all right, let's look at that. Let's play with it. Well, based on what I know, my definition of what is honorable and my definition of what is useful, then I necessarily know that not only was Socrates right, but what is honorable is useful, and what is useful is honorable. And therefore, the corollary is that what is not honorable is not useful, and what is not useful is not honorable. Again, we're getting at philosophical coherency. And that is ultimately what that manifests as an individual, is integrity. So, what is integrity? Integrity is not just being honest, although that is part of it. Integrity is all of the qualities that I harbor, or all the values that I harbor as an individual, working together and being compatible. The integrity, basically, integrity is the state of being whole or undiminished. If I'm talking about the integrity of a submarine hull, the ship hull, it's being whole. It's not, water not pouring in, and the integrity of a person is being a whole person, where all of those values and all of those qualities work together and support one another. and reinforce one another. They're not just compatible, but they're mutually reinforcing. That is integrity. And that is captured in the idea that what is honorable is useful. So I'll leave you with that.
Well said. I think that's a great message to end on, William. We really appreciate your time today. I've learned a lot, and it's been a really valuable podcast for me. So thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. If people want to find out more about what you do, where can they find that out?
So I have, I have a website, williamcspears.com, and the book is, Stoicism as a Warrior Philosophy. It's available anywhere that you get books. But Amazon is the popular one. And I think the booksellers hate that. They're like, the Amazon is some kind of villain to them for reasons that are publisher reasons I don't understand. But it's an easy way to buy books. So I'm fine with it. And they have an audiobook it's funny that I've listened to the guy. They found a guy to do the voice for the audiobook, and he doesn't sound anything like me. He sounds much smarter. That's coming out in November or something like that as well. So anyway, I hope it's valuable to your audience. But no one needs to go buy the book. The good ideas are out there, and what's important is that people, when they come into contact with ideas, that they do come into contact with ideas that alter them in a positive way. And that's ultimately what I want is for people to be altered in a positive way.
Yeah, I love your energy, mate, and I really appreciate your time. And I will put all those links in the show notes. So thanks again.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
I hope you got as much out of this conversation as I did. What really struck me was the way that William spoke about integrity, not as honesty, but as wholeness, as the alignment of all parts of who we are. And that's exactly what men in midlife are craving. Not more success, but more alignment, more meaning, and more internal strength. Stoicism, as William explains, isn't cold or rigid. It's a path to becoming a better human, husband, father, leader, man. I'm curious to know what landed most for you in this conversation. Drop it in the comments. What was your biggest takeaway from this episode? And if you're ready to connect with a community of men doing this work together, join us inside the Midlife Mavericks community. The link is in the show notes. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you next time.